The rain comes softly at first, barely disturbing the surface of Bassenthwaite Lake. Each drop creates its own small circle, a brief impression on the dark water before dissolving into the whole. As dusk settles over the Lake District, the sound intensifies, becoming a constant whisper across 4 miles of ancient depth. This is the hour when the fells fade to shadow, when the boundary between water and sky becomes uncertain, when the lakes remember what they were before humans gave them names. A lone fisherman stands at the northern shore, his line disappearing into water the color of slate. He has fished these lakes for 30 years, knows their moods the way other men know their wives. But tonight, something is different. The rain falls straight down, yet the water moves in ways rain cannot explain. Ripples spread from a point 50 feet offshore, moving against the current, moving with purpose. The pattern is wrong. Fish do not create these disturbances. Wind does not push water uphill. He watches the ripples widen, watches the surface bulge slightly as something large passes beneath. The movement is unhurried, almost lazy. The motion of something that has no natural predators. Nothing to fear in these depths. His hand tightens on the fishing rod. In the fading light, he cannot see clearly, but he can feel the weight of presence. The sensation of being observed by something that has watched these shores far longer than he has walked them. This is how it begins. Always with ordinary people in ordinary moments, suddenly confronted with the extraordinary. A ripple that should not exist. A shadow too large to be explained. A sound from the deep water that echoes nothing living in these modern times. What lurks beneath England's deepest waters? What ancient thing has made the Lake District its home since long before the Romans came, before the Celts carved their first standing stones, before human memory began recording the world? The question hangs in the mist that rises from Bassenthwaite, from Windermere, from Derwater and Coniston. It whispered through Victorian drawing rooms when gentlemen and ladies spoke in hushed tones of things glimpsed from pleasure boats. It echoes in recent encounters that local police will not discuss, in witness statements that go carefully unreported, in the careful silence that falls over pub conversations, when outsiders ask too many questions. There's a pattern here, though few dare trace its outline. Disappearances that cluster around the deepest lakes, vanishings that occur in still weather, in calm water, where no boat should capsize, where no swimmer should suddenly sink. The pattern stretches back through decades, through centuries perhaps, a thread of absence running through the history of these waters. But patterns require us to see what we would rather ignore, to acknowledge that beneath the postcard beauty of England's most beloved landscape, something vast and old continues its slow, patient existence. The Lake District knows how to keep secrets. Mist rises from the water like breath, obscuring what lies just yards from shore. The fells catch clouds and hold them, creating valleys of whiteness where even familiar paths become alien. At night, when tourists retreat to their warm hotels, the lakes revert to their original nature, becoming again the dark, unknowable voids they were, before we drew them on maps and gave them boundaries. This is when the water sounds change, when the gentle lap of waves becomes something more articulate, almost like communication in a language that predates human speech. Stand on any shore after midnight and listen. The rain creates one rhythm, a steady percussion on water and stone. But beneath it, if you remain still enough, patient enough, other sounds emerge. The deep groan of water moving far below the surface, in currents that follow roots older than the bedrock itself. The splash that comes from no visible source, too heavy to be a jumping fish, too deliberate to be falling stone. The sense, impossible to verify yet impossible to dismiss, that you are not alone in the darkness, that the water watches with attention, focused and intent. Victorian gentlemen documented their sightings with the careful precision of their age. They measured the humps that broke the surface, estimated lengths and widths, compared notes over brandy and cigars. They were rational men, products of an empire built on science and industry, yet they saw what they saw. Their journals remain, locked in local historical societies, filled with sketches and testimony that no one quite knows how to address. To acknowledge them feels absurd. To dismiss them feels dishonest. So they wait in archives, gathering dust, while the lakes continue their patient existence beyond the windows. The recent encounters carry a different weight because they come with cameras, with phones, with technology that should provide proof, but somehow never quite does. Images emerge blurred, distances impossible to judge, shapes that could be anything or nothing. Yet the witnesses persist in their claims, ordinary people with nothing to gain and much to lose by speaking. They describe the same details the Victorians recorded, separated by 100 years, yet telling identical stories. Either we face a conspiracy of imagination spanning centuries, or we face something more unsettling, something that continues to inhabit these waters despite our certainty that such things cannot exist. The question is not whether you believe. Belief is irrelevant to what lives in the deep water. The question is whether you understand what it means that these legends refuse to die, that each generation adds its own testimony to the collection, that the lakes remain places of uncertainty despite all our technology, all our knowledge, all our confident mapping of the world. There are places where the old darkness still pools, where human light has not fully penetrated, where things persist because the world is older and stranger than our certainties allow. As full darkness settles over Bassenthwaite, the fisherman finally reels in his line. The ripples have ceased, the surface has smoothed, but he knows he will not return tomorrow. Some knowledge changes you, makes certain places feel different, makes the familiar suddenly foreign. He walks back to his car through rain that falls harder now, and he does not look back at the water. Behind him, the lake continues its ancient rhythm, holding its secrets beneath a surface that reflects nothing but darkness and rain. This is where we begin our investigation, at the edge of deep water, in the place where certainty ends and older truths persist. What follows is a journey into England's hidden history, into waters that have never been fully explored, into stories that refuse to be forgotten. The lakes are waiting, patient as they have always been, ready to reveal what they choose to reveal, content to keep what they choose to keep. And somewhere in that dark water, something ancient stirs, moving against the current, moving with purpose, continuing its existence regardless of our belief or disbelief. The rain falls. The water rises. The story begins. The mists that curl across Bassenthwaite Lake on cold mornings carry memories far older than the name we now whisper in fear. Long before anyone spoke of Eachy, long before Victorian gentlemen with their notebooks arrived to catalogue and dismiss, the waters of the Lake District held something sacred and terrible in the imagination of those who lived along their shore. The Celts who settled these valleys knew the lakes as doorways to another world, places where the boundary between earth and water, between our realm and theirs, grew dangerously thin. In the language of those ancient Britons, water was never simply water. Every lake, every tarn, every deep pool in the rivers held its own spirit, its own guardian. These were not the gentle fairies of later children's tales, but beings of immense power and unpredictable temperament. The Celtic peoples who carved their lives from these unforgiving fells understood that respect must be paid, that certain places demanded caution, that the dark waters concealed presences that predated human memory. They left offerings at the water's edge, small tokens to appease whatever watched from below. They warned their children away from certain coves and inlets where the water ran, especially deep and cold. They knew the lakes were listening. When the Norse came, rowing their longships up the rivers and claiming the valleys for their own, they brought their own water demons with them. The Norse saw serpents in everything, great worms that encircled the world, dragons that lurked in mountain pools. They recognized something in these English lakes that resonated with their own dark mythology, and their stories merged with the Celtic tales already rooted in the landscape. The result was a hybrid folklore, neither purely British nor Scandinavian, but something unique to this corner of England where cultures collided and mingled like the meeting of two cold currents. The name itself, Eachy, carries the weight of this ancient terror. Scholars who have traced its etymology find themselves pulled northward, across the border into Scotland, to a creature so feared that mothers would grab their children at the mere mention of its name. The Eachy, spelled in various ways depending on the dialect, translates roughly as water horse, but this was no noble stallion. The Eachy of Scottish Highlands folklore was a shapeshifter, a predator that appeared as a beautiful horse grazing near a loch's edge. It would seem tame, inviting. Children or unwary travelers would approach, enchanted by its grace. Some would even climb upon its back. And that was when the creature's true nature revealed itself. The moment a rider settled onto the Eachy's back, their hands would stick fast to its hide as if glued there. The horse would bolt directly into the water, plunging into the deepest part of the loch, dragging its screaming victim down to drown and be devoured. The only part of the human body the Eachy would not consume was the liver, which would float to the surface days later, a grim calling card left bobbing among the reeds. This was the creature whose name echoed in Eachy, whose essence seemed to have traveled south into the English lakes, perhaps diluted in form but not in menace. The Lake District's version adapted to its environment. Reports rarely mentioned a horse, though occasionally witnesses described something with a long neck, rising from the water that might, in certain light, resemble an equine head. More often, the creature appeared serpentine, eel-like, something that belonged to the water entirely rather than existing between two worlds. But the danger remained. The Eachy's hunger translated into something equally threatening, a presence in the depths that could overturn boats, pull down livestock that waded too far from shore, and remind humans that they were visitors to a realm that tolerated them only conditional. By the time Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, Britain was transforming. The Age of Reason had arrived, bringing with it a conviction that the world could be catalogued, explained, and stripped of mystery. Naturalists descended upon the Lake District with their specimen jars and measuring instruments, determined to document every species of fish, every variety of water plant, every geological formation. They interviewed the locals with barely concealed condescension, writing down the old stories as curiosities, relics of a superstitious past that education and progress would soon erase. In the journals and letters of these Victorian scholars, we find repeated dismissals of the folklore. One naturalist, writing in 1852, described attending a lecture where a shepherd from the Bassenthwaite area spoke of seeing a creature he estimated at 15 to 20 feet in length, moving through the shallows one evening at dusk. The naturalist's entry drips with superiority as he explains that the man obviously witnessed a large pike, or perhaps a seal that had wandered impossibly far inland. The possibility that the shepherd, who had lived his entire life beside the lake and knew every fish that swam in it, might be reporting something genuine, never seems to have crossed the gentleman scientist's mind. Yet even as the naturalists scoffed, the reports continued. An 1863 letter from a fisherman to his brother, discovered in a Keswick archive in the late 20th century, describes an encounter that still raises the hairs on the back of one's neck. The fisherman wrote that he had been checking his nets just after dawn when he felt his boat lift from beneath, not violently, but with an undeniable sense of something large and deliberate passing underneath. When he looked into the water, he saw, quote, a darkness moving below that was too long to be any fish I have ever pulled from these waters, with a motion that put me in mind of how a serpent moves through grass, all curves and purpose, end quote. The Victorian era produced dozens of such accounts, tucked away in personal correspondence, mentioned in the margins of parish records, whispered in public houses but rarely committed to official documentation. A vicar's diary from 1879 mentions that 3 separate families from the eastern shore of Bassenthwaite came to him within the same month, troubled by nightmares after witnessing what they all described as something large and serpentine breaking the surface of the lake during a storm. The vicar, caught between his education and his pastoral duties, advised prayer but privately confessed in his diary that he himself avoided walking the lake path after sunset, though he could not quite articulate why. The working people of the Lake District, the farmers and fishermen and shepherds who actually lived and labored on the land, maintained a different relationship with the old stories than their educated visitors. They did not necessarily believe in the literal existence of the Eachy, but they did not entirely disbelieve either. They practiced what might be called pragmatic agnosticism. Perhaps there was something in the deep water, perhaps there was not. But either way, caution cost nothing while carelessness could cost everything. They noted which areas of the lake seemed to produce unusual currents. They remembered which coves had a history of drownings that defied easy explanation. They passed down the name Eachy, not as a monster to frighten children, but as a shorthand for all the dangers, known and unknown, that the lake contained. An 1885 report from a geological survey team includes an almost apologetic footnote in which the lead surveyor admits that while taking depth measurements from a rowboat, his equipment detected what he termed an anomalous disturbance at approximately 60 feet down. The disturbance appeared to move horizontally across their measurement path before descending beyond the range of their instruments. The surveyor notes that his 2 assistants, both local men, immediately began rowing for shore and refused to continue measurements in that section of the lake for the remainder of the day. He attributes their reaction to superstition, but concedes that he himself felt an, quote, inexplicable unease, end quote, and did not argue against their decision. What the Victorian naturalists failed to understand, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that folklore serves a function beyond entertainment. The stories about Eachy and its kin encoded genuine dangers, reminded people that deep water demands respect, warned that complacency kills. Whether or not a literal monster lurked in Bassenthwaite Lake mattered less than the fact that the lake itself was genuinely dangerous. People drowned in those waters with grim regularity. Sudden storms could capsize boats. Hidden currents could pull a swimmer under. The lake bed dropped away with shocking steepness in certain areas. The folklore simply personified these hazards, gave them a name and a face, made them easier to remember and respect. But the reports speak of something more than misidentified fish or waves mistaken for living creatures. They speak of something intelligent, something that watches. The consistency across centuries, the way independent witnesses, separated by decades, describe the same serpentine movement, the same sense of deliberate awareness, suggests that dismissing these accounts as pure fantasy requires its own form of blind faith. The Lake District's water runs deep and dark, fed by underground sources that have never been fully mapped. What lives in those lightless depths, what might have lived there for centuries or millennia, remains an open question despite Victorian certainty to the contrary. The name Eachy itself has become a bridge between the ancient world and our own, carrying the weight of Celtic reverence and Norse fear into modern times. It reminds us that this landscape was old when Rome was young, that the lakes remember things we have chosen to forget. The water holds its secrets close, revealing them only in glimpses, a curve breaking the surface, a shadow that moves with purpose, a ripple that travels against the wind. And those who live beside these waters, who watch them change with the seasons and the light, know that some mysteries resist explanation, that some boundaries between myth and reality remain as permeable as the mist that rises each morning from Bassenthwaite's cold embrace. The morning of June the 7th, 1973, dawned clear and still over Bassenthwaite Lake. Reverend Donald McIntyre had risen early, as was his custom, to spend the first hours of daylight in quiet contemplation before the demands of parish life claimed his attention. He and his wife Margaret had decided to walk along the northeastern shore of the lake, a stretch of water they had visited countless times during their 5 years in the Lake District. The air held that peculiar crystalline quality that sometimes graces early summer mornings in Cumbria, when the moisture from the night hasn't quite lifted, and everything seems suspended in a kind of luminous haze. It was approximately 7:45 in the morning, when they settled on a rocky outcrop that jutted into the water near what locals called Scarness Point. The vicar would later recall, with the precision that made his testimony so compelling, that the surface of the lake was almost perfectly smooth, disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface or a waterfowl making its morning rounds. There was virtually no wind, he emphasized, which became crucial to understanding what happened next. Margaret had brought along a small journal where she liked to sketch the surrounding fells, and the Reverend had intended to read from a collection of Wordsworth's poetry, feeling it appropriate to the setting. They had been there for perhaps 20 minutes when Margaret's hand suddenly gripped her husband's arm. She said nothing at first, merely pointed toward a spot in the water, roughly 200 yards from where they sat. The Reverend followed her gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. Something was moving through the water, something that had no business being there, something that defied every rational explanation his educated mind could produce. What they witnessed over the next 12 minutes would transform their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. The creature, for they could think of no other word to describe it, moved with what the Reverend later termed deliberate purpose. This was not the random thrashing of a large fish or the playful movements of an otter. This was something moving from one point to another with clear intent, cutting through the glassy surface of Bassenthwaite Lake with steady, unhurried power. The Reverend's description was meticulous, delivered with the careful attention to detail that came from years of preparing sermons and choosing his words with precision. The creature appeared to be between 15 and 20 feet in length, he estimated, though he admitted that judging size across open water presented certain challenges. What struck him most forcefully was the distinctly humped appearance of its back. Not one hump, he clarified, but a series of undulations that rose and fell as it moved, creating a profile unlike anything he had encountered in his considerable reading of natural history. The color, he noted, was a dark gray, or perhaps gray-brown, though the morning light made precise determination difficult. The surface appeared smooth rather than scaled, though again, distance and water conditions prevented absolute certainty. What he could state with confidence was that whatever created those humps was solid and substantial, displacing water in a manner that suggested significant mass and power. Margaret McIntyre's observations matched her husband's in every particular, a fact that would later prove crucial to the credibility of their account. She noted especially the wake the creature produced, a V-shaped pattern that spread behind it, in a way that seemed inconsistent with any known fish or waterfowl. The wake suggested something moving just below the surface, with only portions of its back breaking through intermittently. She described the motion as sinuous, serpentine, though she hesitated to use that word initially because of the mythological connotations it carried. The creature traveled in a roughly diagonal path across their field of vision, moving from their right to their left, from the direction of Bowness Bay toward the deeper waters of the lake's center. Its speed was steady but not rapid. The Reverend estimated perhaps 4 to 5 miles per hour, the pace of a person walking with purpose, but not hurrying. There was, he insisted, an eerie quality to its movement, as though it was entirely unconcerned with being observed, focused solely on reaching whatever destination it had in mind. At one point, when the creature was perhaps closest to their position, roughly 150 yards distant, both witnesses reported seeing what might have been a head or neck extension rising briefly from the water ahead of the humped back. This portion appeared narrower than the main body, Margaret recalled, and seemed to swivel or turn, though whether it was looking in their direction they could not say. The entire extension remained visible for no more than 10 or 15 seconds before submerging again, leaving only the rhythmic rise and fall of the humps to mark the creature's passage. The Reverend reached instinctively for Margaret's hand, and they sat in what he later described as transfixed silence, watching something that their minds struggled to categorize or accept. Here was a man who had devoted his life to matters of faith and reason, who prided himself on a rational approach to the mysteries of existence, confronted with something that belonged to neither category comfortably. It was not a spiritual vision or a test of faith. It was simply there, physical and undeniable, moving through the water with patient certainty. As the creature continued its journey, gradually increasing its distance from the shore, the humps became less distinct, harder to differentiate from the slight chop that had begun to develop on the water's surface as the morning breeze picked up. By approximately 8:07 that morning, the Reverend noted, checking his watch with the habit of a man who structured his days carefully, the disturbance had faded entirely from view, either because the creature had submerged completely, or because it had moved beyond the range where they could distinguish it from the natural movement of the water. They sat for another half-hour in near silence, each processing what they had witnessed, each perhaps hoping the creature might reappear to confirm that the previous minutes had been real, and not some shared delusion. But the lake remained empty of anything unusual, returning to its customary morning stillness. Finally, Margaret spoke, asking her husband what they should do. It was a question that would haunt him for weeks. The Reverend McIntyre's first instinct was silence. He understood immediately the position he occupied in the community, the expectations people held of him as a figure of moral and intellectual authority. To come forward with such a claim, he reasoned, would invite ridicule at best and questions about his mental fitness at worst. How could he stand in his pulpit on Sunday and deliver a sermon when half his congregation would be wondering if their vicar had lost his grip on reality? He had heard the stories, of course, the whispered tales of strange things in the lakes, but he had always dismissed them as folklore, the kind of colorful local legend that added character to a region but held no actual truth. For 3 weeks, he remained silent. He told no one outside his immediate household, swearing his wife to secrecy as well. He went about his pastoral duties, conducted services, visited the sick, counseled the troubled, all while carrying the weight of what he had seen. Margaret respected his wishes, though she later admitted that keeping silent felt almost dishonest, as though they were denying a truth that deserved acknowledgement. What finally changed his mind was a conversation with an elderly parishioner, a woman named Mrs. Ellen Hartley, who had lived in the area for over 70 years. She had come to him for what seemed like routine spiritual counsel, but as their conversation progressed, she mentioned in passing that she had once seen something strange in Bassenthwaite Lake, many years before, something she had never told anyone because who would believe an old woman's stories? The Reverend found himself describing his own sighting before he quite realized what he was doing, and the relief on Mrs. Hartley's face was profound and immediate. She told him of her own encounter in 1947, when she had seen something remarkably similar from a different vantage point on the lake. She had kept silent for over 25 years, fearing exactly what the Reverend feared now. But his account validated her experience, gave it weight and reality it had lacked when locked away in her memory alone. That conversation convinced the Reverend that silence served no one. If his testimony could give courage to others who had witnessed the unexplainable, if it could add to a body of evidence that might eventually yield understanding, then his duty was clear. He contacted the local newspaper, the Cumberland News, and provided them with a detailed written account of what he and Margaret had observed. The story appeared in late June of 1973, and its impact was immediate and far-reaching. The credibility factor was undeniable. This was not some excitable tourist or attention-seeking local character. This was a respected clergyman, a man of education and standing, whose wife corroborated every detail of his account. The specificity of his observations, the careful qualifications he offered regarding what he could and could not determine with certainty, the admission of his own initial skepticism, all of this lent his testimony a weight that previous sightings had lacked. Within days of the story's publication, other witnesses began to come forward. People who had seen similar things years or even decades earlier, but had remained silent out of fear of mockery, found their courage in the Reverend's example. The archive of Bassenthwaite Lake sightings began to grow, and patterns emerged. Multiple witnesses described the same humped appearance, the same deliberate movement, the same grayish coloration. The accumulated testimony began to suggest that whatever inhabited these waters, it was not a one-time anomaly or a case of mistaken identity repeated independently. The Reverend's sighting became a watershed moment in the history of lake creature reports in the United Kingdom. It demonstrated that credible, educated, reliable witnesses could see things that defied conventional explanation. It opened a door for serious inquiry rather than dismissive ridicule. And it established that sometimes the most profound mysteries are witnessed not by those seeking them out, but by ordinary people going about ordinary days, suddenly confronted with the extraordinary reality that our world contains more than our comfortable categories can contain. The morning of June 14, 1996, began like any other for William Hodgson. He had been fishing Derwent water for the better part of 3 decades, knew every inlet and shadow of the lake as intimately as the lines on his own weathered hands. At 52 years old, he considered himself a practical man, someone who dealt in the measurable world of depths and currents, of weather patterns and fish migration. What happened that day would shake the foundation of that careful rationality, and leave him questioning everything he thought he understood about the waters he had called his second home. William launched his small fishing vessel just after dawn, a 16-foot aluminum boat that had served him faithfully for years. The lake stretched before him in that peculiar stillness that comes just after sunrise, when the water holds the sky like a mirror and the mountains seem to lean in closer, as if listening. He headed for a spot he had fished countless times before, a deeper section near the eastern shore where the lake bed dropped away sharply, and the trout ran large and plentiful. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so, with barely a whisper of wind to disturb its glassy surface. By mid-morning, he had anchored roughly 400 yards from shore, his sonar equipment showing the bottom at approximately 120 feet below. This was prime fishing territory, and he had settled into the familiar rhythm of the work, the gentle rocking of the boat, the occasional cry of a gull overhead. His sonar screen displayed the usual readings, the dark line of the lake bed, occasional smaller marks indicating fish passing beneath. Everything was as it should be. Then, at approximately 10:45, something changed. William felt it before he saw anything on his equipment, a subtle shift in the boat's movement, as though the water itself had become denser, more resistant. The gentle rocking took on an irregular pattern, a sideways pull that made no sense given the absence of wind or current. He glanced at his sonar screen, and his breath caught in his throat. There, moving slowly across the display, was a return signal unlike anything he had encountered in 30 years of fishing these waters. It was massive, stretching across a significant portion of the screen, and it was rising from the depths. The object, whatever it was, appeared to be moving at a depth of approximately 80 feet, ascending slowly but deliberately. William's first thought was that his equipment had malfunctioned, but a quick check showed all systems operating normally. He watched, transfixed, as the shape on the screen grew larger, closer. The reading suggested something at least 20 to 25 feet in length, far larger than any fish known to inhabit Derwent water. Pike were the largest predators in the lake, occasionally reaching 4 feet, but this was something entirely different in scale. The boat lurched suddenly, a sharp jolt that sent William stumbling against the side. It was not a wave, or the impact of floating debris. This came from below, a solid strike against the hull that resonated through the aluminum with a deep, reverberating thud. His heart hammering, William gripped the edge of the boat and stared down into the water. The surface, moments before so clear and calm, had become opaque, the depths concealing whatever had just made contact with his vessel. For several seconds, nothing happened. The boat drifted in uneasy silence, and William found himself holding his breath, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. Then the water beside the boat began to move, not in the normal pattern of waves or wake, but with a swelling, bulging motion, as if something enormous was displacing a tremendous volume of liquid from below. The surface began to darken, a shadow rising from the depths, growing larger and more defined with each passing moment. William would later struggle to find adequate words for what he witnessed next. The thing that surfaced was not a fish, at least not in any conventional sense that his experience could categorize. What broke the surface briefly, no more than 3 or 4 seconds, was dark and massive, with a texture he described as somewhere between scaled and smooth, glistening with water and something else. A kind of organic sheen that caught the light in an unsettling way. He caught an impression of bulk, of muscular power, of something that moved with terrible purpose. There was no clear head or tail visible, just this immense dark mass that displaced water in quantities that should not have been possible for anything living in a landlocked lake. The wake it created defied everything William knew about how objects moved through water. Instead of the expected V pattern of displacement, the water churned and roiled in concentric circles, as if the creature was moving both horizontally and vertically simultaneously. Waves radiated outward in patterns that seemed almost geometric in their precision, colliding with each other to create standing peaks that made no physical sense. The boat rocked violently, caught in these competing forces, and William had to brace himself to avoid being thrown overboard. But it was the feeling that truly unmanned him. In those few seconds, when the thing surfaced beside his boat, William experienced something he had never felt before on Derwent water, despite decades of solitary fishing in all weathers and conditions. It was a sensation of being observed, evaluated by an intelligence that existed in a realm completely alien to his own. The primal fear that washed over him was not the rational concern of a man facing a dangerous animal, but something deeper, more instinctual. Every fiber of his being screamed at him that he was in the presence of something that should not exist, something that upset the natural order he had always believed governed the world. The creature, if that word even applied, submerged as quickly as it had appeared. The roiling water settled into irregular waves that slapped against the hull with metronomic persistence. William stood frozen, staring at the spot where it had been, his hands trembling despite his attempt to steady them. He looked again at his sonar screen. The massive shape was descending now, dropping back toward the lake bed with surprising speed. Within 30 seconds, it had disappeared from the range of his equipment, either diving deeper than his sonar could penetrate or moving laterally beyond its scope. The silence that followed was oppressive. The gulls that had been circling earlier were gone. No breeze disturbed the air. William became acutely aware of the depth beneath him, 120 feet of dark water that might conceal anything. The lake bed that had always seemed like solid, noble ground now felt like a thin barrier separating him from something vast and unknowable. Every shadow in the water, every subtle movement, set his nerves jangling. He tried to rationalize what he had experienced. Perhaps it was a large sturgeon, though none had been documented in Derwent water in modern times. Maybe debris from the lake bed had broken free and surfaced, though that would not explain the sonar readings or the purposeful movement. The explanations felt hollow even as he formulated them, inadequate frameworks trying to contain an experience that resisted categorization. William's hands moved almost of their own accord, pulling up the anchor with a speed born of pure instinct. He started the motor and turned the boat toward shore, resisting the overwhelming urge to open the throttle fully. Some part of his mind insisted that fleeing at top speed might trigger a pursuit, might draw the attention of whatever lurked below. He maintained a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the water around the boat, watching for any sign of that massive shape returning. The journey to shore felt interminable. Every ripple in the water, every play of shadow and light, sent adrenaline coursing through his system. The sensation of being watched persisted, a crawling awareness along his spine that suggested eyes, or something like eyes, tracking his progress from beneath. He found himself thinking about the depth, about how something that size could move through water with such apparent ease, about how many times he had fished this same spot in blissful ignorance of what might swim below. When the bow finally scraped against the shore, William experienced a relief so profound it left him momentarily weak. He pulled the boat well up onto the beach, further than necessary, as if even a few extra feet between himself and the water might provide additional safety. His legs shook as he stood on solid ground, and he turned to look back at the lake. From shore it appeared peaceful, beautiful even, its surface reflecting the surrounding fells in perfect tranquility. Nothing in that serene vista suggested the terror he had just experienced. Over the following days and weeks, William found himself unable to return to that section of Derwent water. He tried once, 3 weeks after the incident, launching his boat with the intention of proving to himself that what he had experienced was somehow explainable, that daylight and distance would diminish the memory into something manageable. He made it perhaps 200 yards from shore before the fear overwhelmed him. The water that had once been his refuge now felt hostile, concealing, and the depth that had always provided the best fishing now seemed like a threat. He turned back and never attempted the journey again. He kept the sonar readings, printed them out, and stored them in a folder he rarely opened. The images showed clearly what his equipment had detected, a large object moving at depth, ascending, and then descending. He showed them to a few fellow fishermen, received the expected skepticism and suggestions of equipment malfunction. But William knew what he had felt when the boat was struck, what he had seen when that dark mass briefly broke the surface. The physical evidence of the sonar readings merely confirmed what his body and instincts had already accepted. In the years that followed, William Hodgson continued to fish Derwent water, but he restricted himself to the shallower areas near the northern shore, places where the bottom was clearly visible and the depth never exceeded 20 or 30 feet. He sold his sonar equipment, claiming he no longer needed it for the type of fishing he now preferred. To those who knew him well, the change was remarkable. The man who had once sought out the deepest, most challenging spots on the lake now stayed in waters where he could see the bottom, where the depth could not conceal anything of significant size. He spoke rarely about what happened that June morning in 1996, and when he did, he chose his words carefully, aware of how the story sounded, how easily it could be dismissed. But there was no dismissing the look in his eyes when he talked about the feeling of being watched from below, or the way his hands still trembled slightly when describing the impact against his hull. Whatever William Hodgson encountered in the deep waters of Derwent water changed him fundamentally, transformed his relationship with a lake he thought he knew completely. The primal fear that drove him to shore that day never entirely left him, a constant reminder that beneath the beautiful surface of familiar waters, there might exist things that defy our careful categories and challenge our assumption that we truly know the world around us. Thomas Noblet had visited the Lake District dozens of times before that morning in June of 2002. He knew the rhythms of Bassenthwaite Lake, the way regular visitors come to know a place, understood how the water typically moved in early summer when the winds came down from the fells. That knowledge made what he saw through his camera viewfinder all the more unsettling. The day had started ordinarily enough. Noblet and his wife had driven up from Manchester for a long weekend, staying at a bed and breakfast just outside Keswick. They'd risen early to catch the morning light, the kind of soft golden glow that photographers prize. Bassenthwaite stretched before them, mirror calm in the pre-dawn stillness. The peaks of Skiddaw loomed to the east, their silhouettes just beginning to separate from the darkness. Noblet was setting up his tripod when the water began to move. What caught his attention first was the wake, not the gentle ripple of a duck or the spreading rings from a jumping fish, but something altogether different. A V-shaped disturbance was cutting across the glassy surface, originating from a point roughly 200 yards offshore. The pattern suggested movement, purposeful and sustained, something traveling beneath the surface with considerable mass. He grabbed his camera and started shooting. The first few frames captured only the wake itself, that distinctive chevron pattern spreading across water that should have been still. But as he kept his finger on the shutter, something else appeared in his viewfinder. Beneath the disturbed water, just visible through the ripples and refracted light, a dark shape seemed to move. It wasn't a clear outline, nothing so definitive. Instead, it presented as a shadow, a zone of deeper darkness that suggested bulk and form without revealing specifics. The mass appeared elongated, possibly segmented, though the water's distortion made certainty impossible. Noblet would later tell investigators that he shot nearly an entire roll of film in perhaps 90 seconds. His hands were shaking by the end, adrenaline overriding the photographer's discipline he'd cultivated over years. His wife stood beside him, asking what he was seeing, but he couldn't spare the breath to explain. He just kept shooting until whatever was down there passed beyond his angle of view, and the wake began to dissipate. When he had the film developed 3 days later at a shop in Manchester, the technician processing the images asked if he'd been trying to capture something specific in the water. The question sent a chill down Noblet's spine. He hadn't mentioned anything to anyone except his wife. The fact that a stranger could see something unusual in the photographs seemed to validate what part of him had begun to doubt. The images, when examined closely, showed exactly what Noblet remembered. The wake patterns were clear and unambiguous, cutting across the lake's surface with the kind of hydrodynamic efficiency that suggested something streamlined moving at depth. Wake analysis would later become a point of intense scrutiny. Several amateur researchers with backgrounds in maritime studies examined the photographs and concluded that the pattern was consistent with a large object moving underwater at approximately 6 to 8 miles per hour. The V-shaped wake formation, they argued, indicated something creating significant displacement, pushing water aside as it traveled. More intriguing was what appeared beneath the surface. In 7 of the photographs, enhanced and enlarged, a dark mass was visible through the water. Its size was difficult to determine with precision given the lack of reference points and the refractive properties of water, but estimates based on the wake width suggested something between 12 and 18 feet in length. The shape appeared to show some kind of undulation or segmentation, leading to speculation about whether multiple humps were breaking the surface, or if the object possessed a naturally curved or irregular profile. Noblet initially hesitated to share the photographs publicly. He was a member of a regional photography club, well respected among his peers, and he worried about the ridicule that might follow if he went public with images of what amounted to a lake monster sighting. But his wife convinced him that the photographs deserved scrutiny, that keeping them hidden served no purpose. In July of 2002, roughly a month after the sighting, Noblet allowed the images to be published in the Cumberland News, a local newspaper that had covered similar sightings in the past. The reaction was immediate and divided. Skeptics dismissed the photographs as showing nothing more than a submerged log, or perhaps a seal that had made its way inland from the coast. Bassenthwaite connects to the sea via the River Derwent, and while it would be unusual for a seal to travel so far upstream, it wasn't impossible. Others suggested the wake could be explained by a large pike or group of fish, though archaeologists pointed out that pike rarely create such pronounced surface disturbances and don't typically travel in the sustained directional manner shown in the photographs. What couldn't be easily dismissed was what happened next. The publication of Noblet's photographs seemed to open a floodgate of reports that had been waiting for validation. Throughout the summer of 2002, sightings at Bassenthwaite Lake increased dramatically. What had been an occasional, almost embarrassed mention of something unusual in the water became a steady stream of witnesses coming forward with their own encounters. In early August, a family from Leeds reported seeing what they described as 3 humps breaking the surface near the western shore. The father, a civil engineer named Peter Ashworth, watched the shapes through binoculars for approximately 5 minutes before they submerged. He described them as dark, possibly black or very dark brown, and moving in sequence as if connected by a single body beneath the water. His 12-year-old daughter managed to capture a few frames of video on her handheld camera, but the distance and the camera's limited zoom rendered the footage frustratingly unclear. Dark shapes were visible on the water, but their nature remained ambiguous. 2 weeks later, a local farmer named William Hargreaves reported an early morning sighting while walking his border collie along the lake's edge. He described seeing a wake similar to what appeared in Noblet's photographs, followed by what he insisted was a head or neck rising briefly from the water. Hargreaves was a third-generation farmer, a man not given to flights of fancy or seeking attention. His report carried weight in the community, and it added to the growing sense that something genuinely anomalous might be present in the lake. By September of 2002, 3 amateur investigation groups had formed, drawn from the Lake District and from further afield. These weren't trained cryptozoologists, if such a thing truly exists, but rather collections of enthusiasts, amateur naturalists, photographers, and people simply fascinated by the possibility of an unknown animal. They brought cameras, video equipment, and a determination to capture definitive proof of whatever was creating these sightings. The Bassenthwaite Research Initiative, as the largest group called itself, established regular observation points around the lake. They maintained a log of water conditions, weather patterns, and times of day when sightings were most commonly reported. Early mornings emerged as the prime window, those hours just after dawn, when the lake was typically calm and visibility was good. The group organized weekend watches, with volunteers taking shifts to ensure continuous coverage during peak times. What followed became emblematic of the frustrations that plagued cryptozoological research everywhere. The pattern that emerged was one of tantalizing near misses and ambiguous documentation. Someone would spot something unusual, but by the time a camera was ready, the object had submerged. Video footage would be captured, but the distance or light conditions rendered it inconclusive. Photographs showed wakes and disturbances, but nothing definitive enough to silence skeptics. One investigator, a retired geology professor named Margaret Ellsworth, spent 3 months camped at various points around the lake. She accumulated hours of video footage showing the water's surface, but in all that time, she captured only 2 sequences that showed anything potentially anomalous. Both featured dark shapes moving beneath the surface, visible for seconds before disappearing into deeper water. When analyzed frame by frame, the shapes suggested bulk and movement, but nothing more specific could be determined. Ellsworth remained convinced she had documented something unknown, but she acknowledged that her footage fell short of proof. The frustration wore on the investigation groups. Equipment failures seemed to occur at crucial moments. Cameras would malfunction, batteries would die despite being freshly charged, memory cards would corrupt. Some investigators began to speak of the lake as if it were actively resisting documentation, though most recognized this as the psychological toll of repeated disappointment, rather than any genuine supernatural interference. Expert opinions on Noblet's photographs and the subsequent wave of sightings remained divided. Marine biologists consulted by various media outlets offered explanations ranging from misidentified known animals to wind effects creating unusual water patterns. Dr. Henry Whitmore, a specialist in freshwater ecology from Lancaster University, examined the photographs extensively. His conclusion was cautiously worded but intriguing. He stated that while the images didn't constitute proof of an unknown species, they also couldn't be easily explained by known animals typically found in the lake. The wake pattern, in particular, suggested something larger than any fish documented in Bassenthwaite and more sustained in its movement than a bird or mammal coming to the surface. As autumn arrived and the weather turned, the investigation groups scaled back their activities. The tourist season had ended, taking with it the casual observers and weekend researchers. A core group continued monitoring the lake into winter, but sightings declined as they typically did in colder months. The photographs Thomas Noblet had taken that June morning remained the most compelling evidence generated during the entire episode, a collection of images that showed something but refused to reveal exactly what. The summer of 2002 entered the folklore of Bassenthwaite Lake, as a time when something almost broke through into certainty, when proof felt tantalizingly close but remained just beyond reach. The photographs continue to circulate among cryptozoology enthusiasts, analyzed and reanalyzed, enhanced and debated. They represent both the promise and the perpetual frustration of lake monster research. Evidence that something unusual occurred without providing the definitive answers that would settle the question once and for all. The night of August 15, 2017, began like countless other summer evenings at Ullswater, with the lake's surface reflecting the gathering dusk in shades of deep violet and silver. For 32-year-old Thomas Henley and his partner Sarah Mitchell, both experienced swimmers who had grown up along the Cumberland coastline, the idea of a moonlit swim seemed like the perfect end to a warm day. They had swum in these waters dozens of times before, always during daylight hours, but on this particular evening, something about the stillness of the air and the promise of a clear sky convinced them to stay past sunset. Neither of them could have anticipated that their decision would result in an encounter that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about what lived beneath the surface of England's second largest lake. They entered the water around 10:30 that evening, wading out from the pebbly beach near Glenridding. Sarah would later describe the water as unusually calm, almost unnaturally so, with barely a ripple disturbing the mirror-like surface. The moon had risen full and bright, creating a pathway of silver light across the lake that seemed to beckon them further from shore. Thomas remembers feeling completely at ease during those first 15 minutes, enjoying the sensory experience of cool water against his skin and the freedom of movement that swimming always provided him. They stayed relatively close to one another, perhaps 30 feet from the shoreline, treading water and talking in low voices about nothing particularly important. The nearest other people were campers nearly half a mile down the shore, their distant campfire visible as a small orange dot against the darkened landscape. It was Sarah who first sensed that something had changed. She described it initially as a feeling rather than anything concrete, a sudden awareness that the water around her felt different. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in the space of moments, and she noticed that Thomas had gone quiet, his head turning slowly as he scanned the surface of the lake. When she asked him what was wrong, he told her to be still, to stop moving for just a moment. In that silence, with both of them floating motionless in the dark water, they felt it clearly. Something was moving beneath them, something large enough to create currents that pushed against their bodies in subtle but unmistakable ways. Thomas would later tell investigators that his first rational thought was that they were feeling the movement of a large fish, perhaps a pike, though he immediately recognized that the sensation was wrong for that explanation. The movement felt too deliberate, too controlled. It was circling them, he realized with growing unease, moving in a wide arc that kept whatever it was just beyond the range of their vision in the dark water below. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin with enough force to leave marks that would still be visible the next day. She had seen something, she whispered urgently. A shape had passed directly beneath her, close enough that she could make out its mass as a darker shadow against the already dark water, close enough that she was certain it had been aware of her presence. They made the decision, simultaneously, without needing to discuss it, that they needed to return to shore immediately. But the moment they began to swim, the thing in the water changed its behavior. The circling pattern tightened, drawing closer, and both swimmers felt the unmistakable sensation of something large moving past them, creating turbulence that rocked their bodies in the water. Thomas described feeling a wave of primal terror, unlike anything he had experienced before. A fear that seemed to bypass all rational thought and connect directly to some ancient part of his brain that understood, on an instinctive level, that he was prey. They were perhaps 70 feet from shore when Sarah saw it surface. The creature, or whatever it was, broke through the moonlit surface of the water roughly 20 feet ahead of them, creating a disturbance that sent ripples spreading outward in perfect circles. What she saw in that moment would haunt her dreams for months afterward. The shape was massive, far larger than any fish that should exist in Ullswater, and it moved with a fluid grace that suggested complete mastery of its environment. She could not make out distinct features in the darkness and the confusion of the moment, but she saw enough to know that this was something substantial, something real and physical and utterly out of place in these waters. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter, both swimmers would later agree, was the undeniable sense of intelligence behind the creature's actions. This was not the random movement of an animal going about its business. The thing in the water was following them, tracking their progress toward shore with what felt like deliberate intent. When they changed direction slightly, angling toward a different section of beach, the movement in the water adjusted to match their new trajectory. When Thomas stopped swimming for a moment, exhausted and disoriented, the circling pattern slowed as well, as if whatever stalked them was pacing itself to their movements, studying them. Sarah felt it touch her first. Something rough, like sandpaper drawn across skin, scraped along her lower leg from knee to ankle. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, no more, but it was enough to send her into a state of pure panic. She began swimming with desperate, inefficient strokes, abandoning all technique in favor of speed, thrashing through the water in a frenzy of terror. Thomas, hearing her gasps and seeing her wild movements, felt his own fear spike to overwhelming levels. He could see the beach now, tantalizingly close, but the water suddenly felt thick and resistant, as if it had transformed into something that actively worked against his efforts to escape. The psychological horror of those final moments in the water cannot be overstated. Both swimmers described feeling utterly vulnerable, stripped of any ability to defend themselves, or even to see what threatened them. In the water, humans are slow and clumsy, operating in an environment where we have no natural advantages. Whatever circled them in the darkness possessed every advantage: speed, strength, familiarity with the terrain, and the ability to approach unseen from below. Thomas would later say that he understood, in those moments, what it meant to be hunted, to know with absolute certainty that something with unknown intentions had you in its sights, and you were powerless to do anything except flee and hope. When their feet finally touched the rocky bottom of the lake, and they stumbled onto the beach, both swimmers collapsed onto the stones, gasping and shaking with a combination of exhaustion and lingering terror. For several minutes, they could do nothing but lie there, their hearts hammering, their muscles trembling with the after effects of adrenaline. But their ordeal was not quite over. As they gradually regained their composure and sat up to look back at the water, they witnessed something that confirmed their experience had been no hallucination or misunderstanding. The surface of Ullswater, which had been so calm and still when they entered less than an hour earlier, now churned with massive ripples emanating from a point roughly 50 feet offshore. These were not the small disturbances created by wind or the movement of small fish. These were powerful concentric waves that spoke to something very large moving just beneath the surface. The ripples continued for nearly 5 minutes, visible in the moonlight as they spread across the water in perfect geometric patterns. Whatever had followed them to shore remained there, just beyond the shallows, its presence marked by the ongoing disturbance of the water. Thomas used his mobile phone to record a brief video of the ripples, though the footage, later examined by various researchers and enthusiasts, proved frustratingly inconclusive. In the darkness and at that distance, the video showed movement in the water, but revealed nothing about what caused it. Still, the recording provided at least some documentation that something unusual had occurred that night, that the experience had not been purely subjective or imagined. It was only when they stood to gather their belongings and make their way back to their car that Sarah noticed the pain in her leg. Using the light from Thomas's phone, they examined the area where she had felt the contact in the water. 3 parallel scratches ran from just below her knee to her ankle, each roughly 5 inches long. The marks were not deep enough to bleed heavily, but they had broken the skin, and the edges of the scratches appeared ragged and irregular. Thomas, who had training in first aid, examined the wounds carefully. They did not match any injury pattern he recognized from rocks or debris. The scratches were too uniform, too evenly spaced, and they followed the exact path where Sarah had felt something brush against her. In the days following the incident, Sarah visited her doctor to have the scratches properly examined and treated. The physician who saw her noted in the medical report that the wounds were consistent with contact from something rough-textured, possibly organic in nature, but could offer no definitive explanation for what might have caused them. The scratches healed slowly over the following 2 weeks, leaving faint scars that Sarah says serve as a permanent reminder of that night. The couple reported their experience to local authorities and to the Lake District National Park Administration within 48 hours of the incident. Their account was filed and documented, but officials could offer no explanation for what they might have encountered. No known species in Ullswater grows large enough to create the disturbances they described, and while the lake does contain pike and eels, nothing in native population could account for the size and behavior they reported. The scratches on Sarah's leg remained the most tangible piece of evidence, suggesting that whatever they encountered was physical and real, not a trick of light or imagination. What makes this account particularly disturbing is not just the physical evidence or the credibility of the witnesses, but the implications of intelligent, deliberate behavior from an unknown creature. The circling pattern, the adjustment to the swimmer's movements, the apparent decision to follow them all of the way to shore. These details suggest something far more unsettling than a simple case of mistaken identity or an accidental encounter with wildlife. If the couple's account is accurate, something in Ullswater was actively interested in them, tracking them with purpose and intent that remains unknown and deeply troubling to contemplate. The water in Wastwater lies still and dark, dropping away to depths of 258 feet, making it England's deepest lake. But depth alone tells only part of the story. What scientists have discovered about the geology beneath these Cumbrian waters raises questions that neither believers nor skeptics can fully dismiss. When reports of lake monsters began accumulating in the Lake District during the 20th century, serious researchers faced a fundamental problem. How do you investigate something that may not exist? The answer, they decided, lay not in chasing eyewitness accounts, but in understanding whether these lakes could even support such creatures. What they found was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The Lake District's major bodies of water, Windermere, Ullswater, Coniston Water, and Wastwater, share a unique geological origin. Carved by glaciers during the last ice age, they possess characteristics unlike most English waterways. Their depths are dramatic, their waters cold and oxygen poor in the lower levels, and most significantly, many contain underwater features that have never been fully mapped. Dr. James Henderson, a freshwater ecologist who spent 15 years studying Windermere, described the experience of examining sonar readings from the lake's deepest sections as genuinely eerie. The equipment revealed not the smooth basins that appear on most survey maps, but a complex underwater landscape of ridges, trenches, and what appeared to be cave entrances along the rocky walls. Some of these apparent openings measured large enough to accommodate a vehicle. Where they led, if anywhere, remained unknown. This discovery aligned with geological surveys suggesting that the Lake District's limestone substrate contains extensive cave systems, some of which may connect to the lakes themselves. The Ease Gill Cave system, just miles from several major lakes, extends for over 40 miles of mapped passages, making it one of Britain's longest. Researchers have long suspected that similar systems exist beneath the lakes, potentially providing access to underground reservoirs or even connections between separate bodies of water. From a cryptozoological perspective, these underwater caves present a tantalizing possibility. A large aquatic animal could theoretically retreat into such spaces, emerging only occasionally to feed. This would explain the sporadic nature of sightings and the consistent failure of surface searches to locate any creatures. The theory requires several assumptions, certainly, but none that directly contradict known biology. The surviving prehistoric species hypothesis gained traction in the 1960s and 70s. Proponents pointed to cases like the coelacanth, a fish believed extinct for 66 million years until a living specimen was caught in 1938. If one supposedly extinct species could survive undetected, why not others? They noted that plesiosaurs, often cited as models for lake monster sightings, were air-breathing reptiles that would need to surface regularly, making them more likely to be observed than something that lived entirely underwater. But the Lake District presented different conditions than Loch Ness, the more famous site of monster sightings. The Scottish Loch formed approximately 10,000 years ago, during the same glacial period as the English lakes. For a breeding population of large prehistoric animals to exist in either location, they would need to have survived the Ice Age and maintained genetic diversity in isolated freshwater environments. The mathematical models were not encouraging. Population geneticists calculated that a minimum viable population of large vertebrates would require at least 50 to 100 individuals to avoid inbreeding collapse. Creatures of that size would need substantial food sources. The biomass of fish in even the largest lakes seemed insufficient. This led some researchers toward the giant eel hypothesis. European eels migrate to the Sargasso Sea to breed, but some individuals never make the journey. Instead, they remain in freshwater environments, growing far larger than their ocean-bound relatives. Reports of eels reaching lengths of 6 to 9 feet appear in historical records. Could some grow even larger in the deep, cold waters of the Lake District? Dr. Sarah Holm, who conducted eel population studies in Coniston Water during the early 2000s, acknowledged the theoretical possibility. Eels can live for 50 or even 70 years under the right conditions. An eel that never attempted its ocean migration could theoretically reach unusual sizes. She described examining a specimen caught by fishermen in 2003 that measured nearly 5 feet long and weighed 30 pounds, far larger than typical. When asked if one might grow to 12 or 15 feet, she said the evidence didn't support it, but neither could she categorically rule it out. The deep parts of these lakes remain largely unstudied ecosystems. The breakthrough that believers anticipated came in 2018 when an international team led by Professor Neil Gemmell from the University of Otago conducted environmental DNA sampling in Loch Ness. The technique analyzes genetic material that organisms shed into water through skin cells, scales, and waste. Every living thing leaves a genetic trace. The team collected samples from various depths and locations, then sequenced the DNA to create an inventory of everything living in the loch. The results revealed eel DNA in large quantities, leading to renewed speculation about giant eels. But they found no DNA from sharks, catfish, or any known large species that might explain the sighting. More significantly, they found no DNA from any unidentified large vertebrates. For skeptics, this closed the case. For believers, it raised as many questions as it answered. DNA degrades in water dark. A creature that spent most of its time in deep caves, emerging only occasionally, might not shed enough genetic material to be detected, especially if the population was small. The sampling, while comprehensive, still represented tiny fractions of the total water volume, and DNA analysis can only identify species already in genetic databases. Something genuinely unknown would show up as unidentified DNA sequences, which the study did find in small quantities, though these could represent anything from unknown bacteria to degraded DNA from known species. The Loch Ness study inspired similar efforts in the Lake District. In 2021, researchers collected environmental DNA samples from Windermere, focusing on the deepest sections where sightings had been most frequent. The results mirrored the Scottish findings: abundant eel DNA, genetic signatures from known fish species, but nothing definitive pointing to large unidentified animals. Yet a small percentage of the genetic material defied easy classification, fragments too degraded or too different from known species to identify with certainty. Dr. Marcus Webb, who participated in the Windermere study, emphasized what the results didn't prove. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, he noted. The techniques used were sophisticated but not infallible. A small population of unknown animals, particularly if they possessed unusual biology or behavior, could still evade detection. He pointed out that new species are discovered regularly, even in supposedly well-studied environments. The fact that something hasn't been found doesn't mean it isn't there. This brought the investigation back to a fundamental question: how much of these lakes have actually been explored? The answer proved surprisingly unsettling. While surface areas and general depth profiles are well mapped, detailed exploration of the deepest regions remains minimal. The cold, dark water below 150 feet creates challenging conditions for diving. Visibility drops to near zero. The pressure and temperature require specialized equipment. Sonar imaging has provided glimpses of what lies below, but interpretation remains subjective. In 2009, a survey of Westwater using advanced multi-beam sonar revealed the lakebed's dramatic topography: steep walls dropping into a central trench, rocky outcrops rising from the depths, and numerous anomalies that could be geological features, submerged debris, or something else entirely. One particular return, recorded at a depth of 220 feet, showed an object roughly 20 feet long moving slowly along the lakebed before disappearing into what appeared to be a rocky overhang. The survey team classified it as probable large fish, possibly a pike or sturgeon, though neither species typically reaches such size. Cryptozoologists seized on this data as evidence supporting their theories. A small breeding population, perhaps just a few dozen individuals, living primarily in deep water and underwater caves, would be nearly impossible to detect with current methods. They noted that giant squid, creatures reaching lengths of 40 feet or more, remained unfound in their natural habitat until 2012, despite centuries of physical evidence proving their existence. The ocean is vast, certainly, but it's also actively studied by thousands of researchers. The deepest parts of the Lake District's waters see perhaps a few dozen investigative dives per year at most. Skeptics countered with Occam's razor. The simplest explanation for lake monster sightings involves misidentification, psychological factors, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. Floating logs, waves, waterfowl, and known fish species can all create impressions of something unusual, especially at distance or in poor lighting. The brain, constantly trying to make sense of visual information, sometimes fills in details that aren't there, transforming ambiguous shapes into something more dramatic. Elizabeth Norton, a psychologist who studied eyewitness testimony related to anomalous sightings, found consistent patterns in how people reported unusual observations. Witnesses who believed in lake monsters before their sighting described more dramatic encounters and more creature-like features. Those without prior belief reported seeing something strange, but couldn't clearly articulate what. Memory, she noted, is reconstructive rather than reproductive. Each time we recall an event, we subtly alter it, incorporating new information and unconsciously adjusting details to match our expectations. A person who sees something odd on a lake, then spends time reading about lake monsters, may genuinely remember seeing features they didn't initially observe. Yet even skeptical researchers acknowledged certain cases that resisted easy explanation. The multiple witness sightings, where several people independently described similar observations. The cases involving experienced outdoors people and water professionals, individuals whose livelihood depended on accurately reading water conditions. The reports that included unusual water disturbance or sounds, suggesting something physical rather than purely visual misidentification. The debate ultimately returns to the lakes themselves, to those unexplored depths where sonar signals disappear into rocky crevices and cave systems extend into darkness. Less than 5% of the Lake District's underwater cave systems have been mapped. Divers who have explored the accessible sections describe environments that feel genuinely alien, narrow passages opening into chambers, sudden drop-offs into deeper darkness, the constant awareness that you're suspended in a space humans rarely visit. Whether those depths harbor unknown creatures or simply unknown geology may be a question future technology will answer. Or perhaps the mystery will persist, sustained by the uncomfortable truth that in England's deepest waters we've barely looked. 3 months ago, a software engineer from Manchester stood at the edge of Wastwater and watched something large move beneath the surface. She had her phone in her hand, ready to capture images of the sunrise, but what she saw made her forget about the camera entirely. The water was calm, almost glass-like in the early morning stillness, and then it wasn't. Something displaced the water with such force that waves reached the shore where she stood, and she described a shape, dark and enormous, that moved with what she called unmistakable purpose before disappearing into the depths. By the time she thought to raise her phone, there was nothing left but disturbed water and the pounding of her own heart. She posted about it online, then deleted the post within hours after the mockery began. But she knows what she saw, and she knows she'll never look at deep water the same way again. This is the pattern that persists across the Lake District, year after year, decade after decade. The details remain remarkably consistent even as the witnesses change. They describe elongated forms, muscular movement through water, heads that break the surface before submerging again. They talk about the feeling of being watched from below, of sensing something ancient and aware in waters that seem too still. The descriptions haven't changed since the 1800s, and that consistency is perhaps more unsettling than the sightings themselves. Modern technology has given us tools that previous generations could never have imagined. Sonar equipment can map the lake floors in extraordinary detail. Underwater cameras can function at depths where light has never penetrated. Drones can monitor the surface from above with high-definition precision. Amateur investigators arrive with equipment that would have seemed like science fiction just 20 years ago, determined to be the ones who finally capture definitive proof. And yet, the lakes keep their secret. The technology reveals underwater caves and unexpected depths, sunken boats and strange geological formations, but nothing that explains what people continue to see. A local boat operator on Windermere, a man who has worked these waters for 37 years, keeps a logbook that he doesn't show to tourists. In it, he records the strange sightings reported by his clients, the unexplained movements beneath his boat, the times when his sonar picks up something large that shouldn't be there. He doesn't talk about it publicly because he knows how it sounds, but in quiet conversations with other locals, away from the tourists and the skeptics, the stories emerge. There are areas of the lakes that experienced guides avoid, not because of rocks or shallow water, but because of something they can't quite name. A feeling, perhaps, or too many unexplained incidents in the same locations. The fishermen are even more reticent. They spend more time on the water than anyone else, in all weather and at all hours, and they see things that don't make it into official reports. Some refuse to fish certain areas after dark. Others describe catches being taken from their lines by something far larger than any pike, pulled down into depths with such strength that expensive equipment is simply lost. They talk about it among themselves, in harborside pubs after the tourists have left, but suggesting that there might be something genuinely unknown in these waters is a quick way to be dismissed as superstitious or drunk. So they stay quiet, and they avoid certain areas, and they keep fishing. What does it mean that in an age of satellites and smartphones, of constant surveillance and instant sharing, these ancient lakes still harbor mysteries? We map distant planets and explore the deepest ocean trenches, yet Westwater and Windermere and Coniston remain stubbornly unknowable in fundamental ways. Perhaps it suggests that mystery isn't simply a function of poor technology or limited access. Perhaps some places resist complete understanding, holding on to their secrets despite our best efforts to expose them. The Lake District waters are not remote or inaccessible. Millions of people visit each year. The lakes are studied, monitored, photographed constantly. And still, something remains hidden. There are locals, born and raised in these valleys, who refuse to swim in certain areas. They'll kayak and boat, but they won't put their bodies in particular stretches of water. When pressed, they struggle to articulate exactly why. It's just something you learn growing up here, they say. Knowledge passed down not through dramatic warnings, but through quiet example. You notice that your grandmother never swam past a certain point. You realize that the old farmers don't let their dogs into the water at specific locations. These aren't superstitions born of ignorance, but cautions rooted in generations of observation. The locals have watched these waters longer than any scientific study, and they've learned to respect what they don't understand. The question isn't whether something unknown lives in these lakes. The question is what it means that we still can't answer that question with certainty. In 2025, with all our technology and methodology, the Lake District waters remain as mysterious as they were to the Victorian tourists who first reported strange sighting. We've learned the depths and temperatures, mapped every inlet and underwater formation, but we haven't solved the central mystery. Witnesses continue to come forward, risking ridicule to report what they've seen. The descriptions remain consistent. The sightings persist, and the lakes, deep and dark and cold, keep whatever secrets they hold. On foggy evenings, when mist rolls across the water and visibility drops to almost nothing, the old warnings don't seem quite so foolish. The cautions about staying away from the water's edge, about not lingering alone by the shore after dark, about respecting the depths and what they might contain. These warnings have persisted for centuries, passed from generation to generation, and they persist still. Perhaps that's the most telling detail of all. In an age when we've dismissed most folk wisdom as outdated superstition, the people who know these lakes best still heed the old cautions. They still watch the water carefully. They still tell their children to be careful. And on those foggy evenings, when the water is dark and still, and the modern world feels very far away, even the skeptics might find themselves stepping back from the edge, just to be safe. The Lake District's waters are deeper and darker than most realize, and what moves in those depths remains, even now, magnificently and terrifyingly unknown. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.